If I had to list the things I would never do in my life, this story would definitely be at the top. But here I am, sitting here, casting aside all my fears and regrets to tell my secret. Because there are some things you just can't keep bottled up inside. That secret was like a smouldering flame, burning silently. My name is Anabelle. I'm 40 years old. I have a good husband, a marriage that anyone would look at and think was perfect. But not everything is as it seems. My life completely changed just a few months ago. It all began when my husband's son from his first marriage, Jonathan, moved in with us after graduating from college. Jonathan was 23 years old, tall, intelligent, and carried an irresistible confidence. The first time I met him at the door, he stood there with a slight smile and his suitcase in hand. I still remember those eyes, blue like the summer sky, looking at me as if they wanted to say something more than just, hello. Anabelle, this is Jonathan. I told you about him, didn't I? Gregory said as he smiled and helped his son bring his luggage inside. Of course, I replied, trying to keep my tone as normal as possible. Welcome home. Jonathan stepped inside with a casual yet elegant manner. I don't know why, but in that moment, I felt something strange, like something was about to change forever from the day he arrived. I tried to maintain a proper demeanor as a stepmother. I did everything to keep my distance, but that distance felt as fragile as a thin layer of morning mist under the sun. The first time we had a long conversation was in the kitchen. Gregory was away on a business trip, and the whole house belonged to just me and Jonathan. Do you like reading? Jonathan asked as he glanced at the bookshelf in the corner of the kitchen. Yes, I enjoy the classics, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. And you? I do too, especially Hemingway's works. He always has a way of making you think about the things that can't be put into words. I smiled at the depth in his response. From that conversation, I realized that Jonathan wasn't just outwardly attractive. He had a rare sensitivity and depth. But I kept telling myself that it was all just harmless impressions. Yet deep down, I felt as though I was standing at the edge of something I couldn't name. And yes, it was only the beginning. When Gregory left for a week-long business trip, the house became unusually quiet. Jonathan and I often found ourselves sharing the same spaces, but each time we did, we both tried to maintain a careful distance. At first, our conversations revolved around harmless things, books, movies, life in New York. But the more we talked, the more time seemed to stretch on, and it felt like neither of us wanted the conversations to end. One afternoon, as the faint sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, I was making coffee when Jonathan walked in, wearing a faded blue t-shirt that clung to his fit frame. That coffee smells amazing, he said, standing closer than I had expected. Talking to you always makes me feel like I'm back where I belong. My heart pounded. Jonathan's words were calm, but his eyes held something much deeper. I tried to stay composed. Feeling at home is a good thing, I replied, but I avoided meeting his eyes that were fixed on me so intently. Jonathan was silent for a few seconds. It wasn't just an ordinary silence. It was the kind of silence that made you realize something was slipping beyond your control. Anabelle! Jonathan called my name for the first time, his voice low and soft. I turned to look at him. In that moment, the space between us was so small I could feel the warmth of his breath. Don't, I said, my voice trembling, though I didn't know if I was trying to stop him, or myself. Jonathan looked at me as if he was searching for an answer in my eyes. A strange sensation rose in my chest, a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Then, as if sensing the tension in my gaze, Jonathan stepped back slightly. I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable, he said, his voice gentle but sincere. I felt like I'd been freed from an invisible grip, but instead of feeling relieved, I felt an odd emptiness. It's not that, I responded, though I didn't even believe my own words. From that moment on, the distance between us became harder to maintain. The glances that lasted a second too long the silences that seemed filled with unspoken words. Jonathan never crossed the line, but his very presence made me feel trapped in a maze of emotions. That night, it rained heavily, and the entire house was enveloped in the steady sound of rain falling outside the windows. Jonathan and I sat in the living room watching an old classic movie. The only thing separating us was a single throw pillow, but I could feel the warmth radiating from him. When the movie ended, I got up to tidy the room, but Jonathan suddenly spoke. "Annabelle, I've never felt this close to anyone before." I froze as if his words had turned me to stone. I turned back and met Jonathan's gaze. His eyes no longer hid his emotions. My heart pounded loudly in my chest. I should have walked away, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. Those moments felt like an eternity. And when Jonathan gently took my hand, everything seemed to stop. Time, reason, and every ounce of logic I had clung to. "It's late. I need to go to bed," I stammered, pulling my hand back as if I'd touched fire. Jonathan didn't say anything, just stood there silently. That look in his eyes was full of disappointment and a trace of heartbreak. I turned and walked away, but I knew something had changed, not only in Jonathan's gaze, but deep within my own heart. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the rain outside and trying to lull myself to sleep. But Jonathan's face remained vivid in my mind. His words, his eyes, and even his silence. I knew I was standing on the edge of something dangerous, and I wasn't sure if I could step back anymore. The dim golden light from the living room lamp bathed the villa in a soft glow. Outside, the rain continued to pour, as if trying to muffle every sound within the house. I stood at the threshold of the living room, my hand resting lightly on the doorframe as I prepared to leave. But my steps faltered when I heard Jonathan's voice behind me. "Annabelle." I turned around. Jonathan stood there, his eyes alight with something dangerously sincere yet unguarded. "You feel it too, don't you?" His voice was low and trembling. My heart felt as though it was being squeezed tight. I tried to summon my reason to end the conversation, but when Jonathan's eyes met mine, all reason seemed to dissolve. He stepped forward, just a few steps, but it felt as if the space between us vanished entirely. The room seemed to shrink until there was only the two of us. Jonathan gently took my hand. "Please, don't run away anymore." His hand was warm, strong, yet soft in a way that felt like a lullaby against my frantic heart. "Jonathan, this isn't right," I said, but my voice was weak, like a whisper caught in the wind. He leaned in slightly, the distance between us now mere inches. The clean, woodsy scent of him lingered in the air, making me lose my bearings. I felt the warmth of his breath against my cheek. "Sometimes what the heart says is the only thing that's right," Jonathan whispered. And then he leaned down. A gentle kiss, like a silent question I couldn't refuse. The whole world around us disappeared. All that remained was the warmth of his lips, soft and tender, yet filled with longing. My hand instinctively clutched his shirt, as if holding on to a reality that was slipping away. I should have pushed him away. But instead I kissed him back, softly at first, then fiercely, as if we had both waited for this moment forever. Jonathan wrapped his arms around me, pulling me closer, as if trying to make sure this closeness was real. "Annabelle," Jonathan whispered as he pulled away, just enough to take a breath. He brushed a strand of hair from my face, his eyes glowing in the dim light as though trying to etch this moment into eternity. I closed my eyes, feeling the trembling within me and the steady warmth of Jonathan's breath. My heart was pounding so hard, I was certain he could hear it too. His fingers brushed gently across my cheek, then trailed down to my bare shoulder. Every touch was delicate but intense, as though we were crossing the most fragile boundary of all. "We can't go back now, can we?" I whispered, my eyes opening to meet his, filled with fear and a strange kind of surrender. "No," he replied, his voice steady like a vow. "But I don't want to run anymore." I had no words left to deny it. I let my heart take over, letting myself be swept up in a whirlwind of emotions. Jonathan leaned down once more, his breath warm against my lips, pulling me into his arms, safe and dangerous all at once. The rain outside continued like an endless song, and within that house the final line between reason and emotion was erased forever. I woke in the middle of the night as the moonlight shimmered through the thin curtains. The white ceiling looked like it was draped in a hazy mist. The rain had stopped, leaving an eerie stillness so profound that I could hear the steady rhythm of breathing beside me. Jonathan. I turned gently and looked at him as he slept, his face so peaceful it hurt to see. His long eyelashes fluttered slightly as if he were dreaming something sweet. In that moment, my heart tightened like an invisible string being pulled taut. I silently asked myself, how did it ever come to this? But the answer was only silence. I reached out and brushed a hand softly through his tousled hair, an unspoken confession that this wasn't a dream. His familiar scent lingered on his skin, pulling me back to every moment when logic had ceased to matter. The memory of that first kiss, the heat of his breath on my skin, our hearts beating in unison under the cover of night, I remembered it all like a slow-motion film playing in my mind. I closed my eyes, my breath caught in my throat. I wanted time to stop, right here, in this quiet sweetness. But I knew it couldn't. Everything was already beyond my control. Suddenly, Jonathan shifted slightly. His blue eyes fluttered open and found mine immediately in the dim light of the room. A small smile formed on his lips. "You're still awake?" he asked, his voice husky and tender enough to make me want to cry. I nodded, unable to speak. Jonathan lifted my hand and pressed a soft kiss to the back of it. That tenderness felt like a sharp blade cutting through my mind, reminding me that this wasn't a dream. It was an undeniable reality. "We've gone too far," I whispered, my eyes still locked on his. Jonathan didn't answer right away. He just tightened his hold on my hand, his gaze filled with something strong yet fragile. "Anabelle, if there's ever a moment you regret this, tell me," he said, his lips trembling as though afraid of what might happen. I let out a bitter, sorrowful laugh. I had crossed the line, betrayed everything I believed myself to be, and the man I had sworn to be faithful to. But instead of regret, all I felt was that I was sinking deeper into an unnamed feeling that I couldn't escape. "You don't understand," I murmured. "Then let me understand." Jonathan placed both hands on my shoulders, his breath warm against my face. "You've spent so long trying to control everything, but this time, let your heart speak." I looked deeply into his eyes and realized that Jonathan wasn't just a reckless young man. He was a man offering me understanding without judgment, without fear. Something Gregory had never given me in all the years we'd been together. In that moment, I knew I hadn't just crossed the line. I had completely lost myself. I nodded, a silent surrender in my weakness. Jonathan gently pulled me into his arms as if the world around us had never existed. We didn't look back. There was no longer a distinction between right and wrong, no gap between morality and desire. Only the warmth of Jonathan's heartbeat reminded me that whether this was right or wrong, my heart had already made its choice, and I knew that from this moment on, there would be no turning back. The morning in the quiet suburb was so still that I could hear the birds singing outside the window. The early sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting everything in a soft golden glow, as if inviting serenity. I lay there, feeling the lingering warmth of Jonathan's embrace still on my skin. He was still asleep. His serene face looked like the very picture of peace, but inside me a storm churned. I felt torn. Part of me wanted time to freeze, to let me stay lost in this feeling of being loved and understood so deeply. But another part whispered terrifying reminders in my ear. Gregory will be home at any moment. This is a betrayal I can never undo. I shifted slightly to sit up, but Jonathan's hand suddenly reached out and held mine, pulling me back toward him. "Stay." Just a little longer, he whispered, his voice still laced with sleep, but gentle as a plea. I looked into those bright blue eyes and felt an ache in my chest. In his arms, I wasn't the strong, rational, careful woman I had always tried to be. I was simply Anabelle, a woman with fragile desires I had buried for so many years. Jonathan. I tried to say something, but no words came out. Jonathan sat up, gently brushing his hand through my hair, his gaze filled with tenderness, as if nothing mattered to him but this moment with me. "I've never seen you as happy as you are right now," he whispered. "I wish this could last forever." I smiled, but that smile faded into a weary sigh. "Life never allows things to be that simple," I replied, my eyes drifting toward the window as if searching for an escape. Jonathan continued to watch me quietly, as if he were trying to hold on to every fleeting second of this morning. "If this is a mistake," I paused, my voice trembling, "then why does it feel so right?" Jonathan wrapped his arms around me from behind, his warm breath against my shoulder. I closed my eyes, feeling the mix of gentleness and intensity in every touch. My heart seemed to echo the rhythm of his heartbeat. "Then don't think about right or wrong, just this once," he whispered. I turned to look at Jonathan, and in his eyes I saw a peace I had been searching for so long. But that very peace terrified me. It was so fragile that even the smallest glimpse of reality could shatter it into pieces. The sound of the front door clicking open echoed down the hallway like a bolt of lightning striking my ears. I froze, my entire body stiffening in Jonathan's embrace. "Anabelle?" Gregory's voice rang out, pulling me back into the harshness of reality. Jonathan and I looked at each other, and in his eyes, I saw both fear and regret. I quickly stood up, smoothing down my dress and taking a deep breath to regain my composure. Jonathan stepped back, trying to appear calm, though worry lingered in his expression. Gregory entered the living room with a bright smile. He set his suitcase down and stretched out his arms. "I'm home early." I forced a smile and stepped forward to hug my husband, but my eyes avoided his. I felt as though Gregory could sense something different in every one of my movements. "Jonathan, how's your morning?" Gregory asked as he turned to his son. "Did you two have a good time here?" Jonathan smiled faintly, but there was a flicker of tension in his eyes. "Yeah, it was good. Thanks, Dad." I stood there, caught between the two men, feeling like I was balancing on a thin, fragile wire suspended between happiness and ruin. I knew that things couldn't stay like this forever, and I was terrified of each moment that followed, because I had risked everything for this fleeting feeling, and it could all disappear in an instant. The guilt, mixed with fear and brief happiness, made me feel as though I was standing in the middle of a storm of my own making. I asked myself, can I move forward without everything falling apart? Or have I already gone too far to turn back? In the days that followed, the villa was strangely quiet. Not because there was no conversation or laughter, but because the silence held so many unspoken emotions. Everything carried on as usual, breakfast with Gregory, small talk about work. But beneath the surface of that normalcy, Jonathan and I were like two lost souls trapped in the same room. Whenever our eyes met by accident, I felt a rush of heat down my spine. Jonathan would immediately look away, but I knew he felt it too. That awkwardness we couldn't hide, like an ink stain spreading across what was supposed to be a perfect painting. One morning I woke up earlier than usual. The early dawn outside the window stretched across the lake, the rippling water sparkling like threads of silver. I stood in the kitchen stirring my coffee, but my thoughts were tangled like a web. Jonathan walked in, his hair slightly tousled from sleep. When he saw me, he hesitated for a brief second, as if considering something. "Good morning," Jonathan said, his tone calm, though I could immediately sense the unease underneath. I gave him a faint smile, trying to appear composed. "Good morning," I replied, focusing on my cup of coffee as if it were the only thing in the room that mattered. The room became stifling with just the two of us in it. Everything in the room suddenly seemed too vivid. The ticking of the clock, the soft clink of the spoon against the cup, and the tension that hung in the air between us. Jonathan stepped a little closer, but kept just enough distance so that nothing needed to be explained. He took a small breath, as if trying to find the right words. "Is everything okay?" It was a simple question, but it carried 1,000 unspoken meanings that we both understood. I stopped stirring, my eyes fixed on the rippling surface of the coffee in my cup, as if meeting his gaze would make the truth spill out. "Yes, everything's fine," I answered, though my voice echoed in my mind, weaker than I'd expected. Jonathan was silent for a long moment before nodding slightly, but his eyes, those deep, searching eyes, looked at me with countless unanswered questions. In the days that followed, things only grew harder. Jonathan kept to the unspoken promise we'd never said aloud. He kept just enough distance so as not to raise Gregory's suspicions. But I could feel the tension in every fleeting glance and every strained, awkward smile. One afternoon, when Gregory was out meeting a client, I stepped out onto the porch for some fresh air. The light breeze carried the scent of grass and rain from the night before. Jonathan was there, leaning against the railing with a book in his hand, though his gaze was fixed on the still surface of the lake in the distance. I paused at the threshold, unsure whether to step forward or retreat, but Jonathan noticed me before I could make up my mind. "Do you ever wonder if things could have been simpler?" he asked, breaking the silence. I looked at him, unsure how to respond. "Simpler? No." I shook my head, my voice soft. "The truest feelings are always the most complicated." Jonathan smiled faintly, but it was a sad smile. "Yeah, but I still wish that things weren't this complicated." I stepped closer until the distance between us was only a breath. "Jonathan, we've done something we can't take back," I said, my eyes lowering to the wooden planks beneath our feet, as though avoiding his gaze could lessen the weight of my words. "But I don't know if I can live pretending it never happened." He turned to look at me, and for a moment, his eyes seemed to tremble. "Then don't forget," Jonathan said softly, but his voice carried enough weight to shake me to my core. In that moment, I knew that the awkwardness, the fear, and the pretense couldn't last forever. The things left unsaid would only grow like an ember that smoulders until it finally bursts into flame. But right now, I didn't know what I would do when that fire consumed everything. That afternoon stretched longer than I expected. The sun slowly dipped below the horizon, painting the lake in hues of brilliant orange before sinking into darkness. But inside me, everything was still tangled, a knot of feelings without an answer. Jonathan still stood there quietly watching me, his eyes filled with emotions I knew all too well. But this time, I couldn't let the silence drag on any longer. I took a deep breath, as if gathering every last bit of courage left within me. "Jonathan, we can't keep going like this," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. He was silent, his eyes freezing at my words. I knew he was waiting for me to explain, but his silence hurt more than anything else. "Gregory is a good man, and he doesn't deserve this kind of betrayal," I continued. We crossed a line, and I can't keep lying to myself, or to him." Jonathan shook his head, his eyes glinting with defiance. "You think I don't know that. I do. But you know how impossible this is, don't you?" He took a step toward me, close enough that I could hear both of our unsteady breaths. How am I supposed to turn my back on this when it's still here between us? I closed my eyes, trying to stop the tears that were already threatening to fall. "This feeling will always stay. But we have to let it go, Jonathan." Jonathan looked at me as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. A long silence settled between us, a space filled with pain and regret. My heart felt like it was shattering, but I knew this was the right thing to do. So, this is where it ends? Jonathan asked softly, his voice breaking. I didn't answer. I just looked at him with all the sincerity and heartbreak I carried inside me. Finally, he let out a long sigh and stepped back. I recognized that step as his way of accepting it, even if it was reluctant and bitter. That night, I sat in the study for a long time in the dark. I wrote a letter to Gregory, not to confess everything, but to remind myself of the reasons I once loved him, the man who had always tried to build a peaceful life for the two of us. Jonathan left the villa early the next morning. He didn't say goodbye to me directly, but I saw him from a distance as he loaded his bags into the car. The car rolled down the driveway, leaving a faint cloud of dust in the dawn's first light. I stood at the window for what felt like an eternity, feeling as though a part of my heart had left with him. But I knew this was the only way we could move forward without destroying everything completely. 3 months later, Gregory still didn't know what had happened between me and Jonathan. He returned home after every business trip with a warm smile and small gifts for me. We did our best to live like a family should, but I couldn't deny that there were still long nights when I dreamed of Jonathan's eyes and his final whispered words. How could you ever forget this? One afternoon, while walking alone by the lake, I stopped and stared at the still surface of the water. My reflection was faint and distorted in the clear, rippling waves. A soft breeze brushed through my hair, and in that moment, I realized that life is never perfect. It's built from choices and losses. I knew I would always remember Jonathan and the moment my heart lost its way. But I also understood that true happiness isn't just about following our desires. It's about knowing when to let go. I didn't know if I would ever find complete peace with Gregory again. But I knew that whether it was right or wrong, love isn't always about holding on. It's about learning to let go and letting time carry everything away.